Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Friday the 12th of December. I'm Caroline Hepker in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels. Coming up today, US President Donald Trump says America would help with Ukraine's security as he expresses frustration over a lack of progress on ending the war.
Traders say the UK's borrowing penalty, sparked by the Liz Truss mini-budget crisis, is starting to fade.
Plus, how the European company underpinning the global AI boom is planning to keep its irreplaceable status.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Ukraine and the United States are pitching new compromises in an attempt to make progress on talks to end Russia's war. President Volodymyr Zelensky has proposed a referendum that would let Ukrainians vote on whether to hand the Donbas region to Russia. That's part of the eastern territories the Russian military has failed to capture in its nearly 4-year invasion. US President Donald Trump told reporters Ukrainians would back the peace plan he proposed after talking with Russia.
I thought that we were very close with Russia to having a deal. I thought we were very close with Ukraine to having a deal. In fact, other than President Zelensky, his people loved the concept of the deal. You know, we threw something out.
This is a 4-part deal.
Well, there's 4 or 5 different parts. It's, a little bit complicated because you're cutting up land in a certain way. It's not the easiest thing. It's sort of like a complex real estate deal times 1,000, right?
The US President added he would be willing to provide security assistance to Kyiv to get an agreement over the line, but without specifics. Whether Ukraine gives up land has become a key sticking point among its backers, with the rift between America and its European allies becoming increasingly apparent. Ukraine and several European countries are meeting over the weekend to discuss the latest US offer, but it's unclear if an American representative will attend, with Trump branding the talks negative.
The US has sanctioned 6 oil tankers as well as 3 of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's nephews. It comes after the seizure of a crude supertanker on Wednesday, which sources tell Bloomberg is just the start of a new US campaign. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked by reporters if more vessels will be seized.
We're not going to stand by and watch sanctioned vessels sail the seas with black market oil, the proceeds of which will fuel narco-terrorism of rogue and illegitimate regimes around the world.
Caroline Leavitt speaking there. The US actions aim to put pressure on Maduro, deny him oil revenue and force a Venezuelan strongman from office. It comes after Donald Trump ordered a massive US military build-up in the region. US officials have made the case that change in government in Venezuela could have a transformative impact across Latin America.
The premium paid by the UK government to finance its debts has narrowed after Chancellor Rachel Reeves increased her fiscal buffer in last month's budget. The rate the government pays to borrow for 10 years has fallen 12 basis points in the past 3 months, as the US, Germany, France and Italy have seen increases. Gilt yields have become unusually politicised since the 2022 mini-budget crisis that forced out then Prime Minister Liz Truss. Since then, there have been repeated sudden yield spikes on fiscal jitters. Speaking to Bloomberg, former Prime Minister Theresa May acknowledged her party's fiscal mistakes.
Wouldn't use a term like vindicate. What I would say is I think that we, unfortunately, as a Conservative party, were seen to have lost our value of integrity and our economic competence.
Theresa May there speaking to Bloomberg's Leaders with Francine Lacqua. The UK still has the highest bond yields among a group of 7 nations, but the shift is a boost for the government after 17 months in power, marred by missteps and policy U-turns that have occasionally spooked bond markets.
Shares in the chip firm Broadcom fell by more than 4% in post-market trading after its sales outlook failed to meet investor expectations. CEO Hock Tan said the company, which competes with Nvidia, has a backlog of $73 billion in AI product orders, disappointing some investors, later clarifying the figure as a minimum. Bloomberg Intelligence's senior analyst Kunjan Sabani says the market reaction is surprising.
There seems to be an overall fatigue coming into the AI space, but fundamentally, when we just look at Broadcom, this was one of the most strongest AI semis report this quarter. I mean, they beat the AI revenue numbers for next quarter of their fiscal 1Q by almost 1.4 billion, which is a 20% upside to what the street was.
That was Kunja Subani from Bloomberg Intelligence. Broadcom has held off on giving an annual AI revenue forecast, with CEO Tan saying it was a moving target.
One of China's biggest home builders is racing to avert a default on nearly $2 billion worth of local debt. China Vanke is seeking to delay payments on two bonds that are due this month. The company is one of the few major Chinese developers that hasn't defaulted. In the past, Vanke has relied on financial lifelines from its largest state shareholder, but recently that company's shifted its stance and tightened financing terms, adding to the developer's stress. Bankers and fund managers are now rushing to weigh the damage of what could be one of the biggest corporate restructurings in China's history. More than $7 billion of the firm's debts are held by lenders and bond investors overseas.
And lastly, in football, there has been criticism of FIFA's pricing of tickets for the World Cup next year. The Football Supporters Europe fan group described the current prices as extortionate and a monumental betrayal. According to the BBC, tickets for FIFA's showpiece event are as much as 7 times more expensive than the 2022 World Cup, which took place in Qatar. For England fans, watching all 8 matches through to the final will cost a minimum of about £5,225. That's up from £1,466 in 2022. FIFA has not yet commented on its pricing decisions, according to the BBC.
Well, those are your top stories on the markets. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index 1.3% higher this morning. The Topix in Tokyo is up by 2%. European stock futures looking much stronger as well, up 0.6% at the moment. The 10-year Treasury yield holding steady at 4.16%.
Now, in a moment, we'll bring you the latest on efforts to end Russia's war in Ukraine, plus a special report on the future of ASML, the Dutch company underpinning the global AI boom. But before we get to that, something else has caught our eye this Friday. Our opinion columnist Dave Lee's been writing about the mega deal between Disney and OpenAI.
So it's licensed around 200 characters for use on OpenAI's Sora video app. So Lilo and Stitch, Ariel, Simba, all the favourites. They can be used then for generating AI videos in response to user prompts. So in exchange, Disney gets fees and a $1 billion stake in OpenAI. Dave Lee points out, though, that while this looks like a great deal for Disney, OpenAI gets the ability to make these short clips of characters, but they won't be able to talk. That's part of the deal. So... He also points out that this app is for over 13s, and perhaps the people who might be most interested in seeing these characters might be under 13s. But if you look at the long game of all of this, he says that essentially it's good for OpenAI because they're trying to make sure they hold on to those younger AI, your ChatGPT users essentially, who they have a lead over their rivals on as well. And he says it's also a win for the creative industries because it essentially sends the message that if you want to use these sorts of characters created by human ingenuity, you have to pay for them. And that's the part that he thinks we should take away from this deal.
Yeah, I think it's a really, fascinating moment. I just think that with the unpredictable world of AI, it's not actually clear who's going to end up being the winner or the loser in these sorts of deals, because I think it's so unforeseeable what the future of consumption is really going to look like. But I think, it's very, very interesting that you're going to be able to interact with these, hugely sort of meaningful characters to so many people. Yeah, it's a great piece.
You can find it at bloomberg.com/opinion. We'll put a link to it in our podcast show notes as well. Let's bring you more, though, on our top story, and President Trump saying the US would be willing to contribute to Ukraine's security, but showing signs of frustration with the talks over the country's future. Let's discuss with Bloomberg's Tony Halpin, who leads our coverage of Russia's economy and government. Tony, President Trump has dramatically scaled back direct military aid to Ukraine and seems deeply frustrated by not being able to force peace on the country quickly enough. Why?
Good morning. Well, yes. Essentially, President Trump, if you remember, in his election campaign, said he would come to power and finish this war quickly, even within a day. And almost a year later, that hasn't happened. So that's leading somewhat to the frustration levels that's being expressed from the White House. And he's focused some of his ire on President Zelensky. He seems to take issue with Zelensky's insistence on things like security guarantees, on a refusal to concede territory to Russia that Russia insists that it must have as part of any peace deal. And it's really quite notable that he doesn't apply the same sort of pressure on President Putin, who, after all, was responsible for the invasion and could end the war tomorrow simply by declaring a ceasefire and pulling back troops from Ukrainian territory. So essentially, President Trump would like to get on and do business deals with Russia and with Ukraine. He sees very little American interest in the territory that's being fought over. And so he wants to get a deal done basically in any way possible, and when he sees people objecting to particular details of a plan, that leads to frustration in the White House quite quickly.
Despite Russia's size and scale, also President Putin hasn't succeeded on the battlefield, but there is a huge battle about the narrative of the war. I mean, is Ukraine losing that narrative?
Yeah, this is a key issue, I think, because Russia wants to present the idea that inevitably it will win, and that somehow therefore influences President Trump's view about the need to pressure President Zelensky into a deal to end the war on Russia's terms. And of course, Ukraine takes issue with that. They would point out correctly, mostly, that Russia's made very little advance since it was pushed back in late in 2022 after advancing almost as far as Kiev. The war has essentially been limited to areas of eastern and southern Ukraine, and that front line hasn't changed a great deal. We're talking, kilometers here and there, but Ukraine is a very large country. So it's difficult for President Putin to assert that he has won the war in the sense that Ukraine is capitulating. Ukraine clearly isn't capitulating, but it's equally difficult for Ukraine to claim that it's managing to push back Russian forces, because the front line isn't showing that. The front line is showing a kind of gradual Russian advance, and it's quite difficult for Ukraine to hold the line. But we're talking here about kilometers, 20, 30 kilometers over a period of a year, and so both sides are really bogged down, and they're trying to persuade Trump that really that means that they have the advantage and that the other side should be pressured into a deal on their terms.
How should we consider the proposal from the Ukrainian president of a referendum on the Donbass region as well? Is this something that could help to advance the conversation in Ukraine?
Yeah, this is interesting because President Zelensky until now has basically said that he doesn't have the right to sign away Ukrainian territory. By constitution, he doesn't have the right, and as president, he's not entitled to do it. And so now he's floating the idea of a referendum in some ways to say, well, okay, if this forms any part of a peace deal that I can agree to, it's still going to need the endorsement of the Ukrainian people in order to stick. And he's come under some criticism from the US in particular that Ukraine hasn't held elections, presidential elections, simply because martial law is in force and Ukraine is at war. And so he said that, while a referendum on the Donbass region could be one way forward, or it could be put to the people in elections themselves. But there are all kinds of questions here about how this would actually be implemented. I mean, if you imagine that these areas have large populations, how would you enforce these people basically if they voted against being part of Russia or being part of some demilitarized zone? You're essentially compelling them. The rest of Ukraine would be compelling them if they voted yes. And what happens if Ukraine votes no? Does that actually then negate the whole of the deal? So there are lots of questions, but it's an interesting development that he's actually now floating this idea that it should be something that the people should decide on.
What about the meeting this weekend? The White House non-committal about sending a US representative to these talks between Ukraine and European leaders. And there's still the question of the frozen Russian assets, that Europe has yet to decide on.
Yeah, so there are two elements. One of the key elements for Ukraine is getting clarity on what security guarantees it would receive in the event of any peace deal, because the Budapest memorandum of long ago was supposed to assure its security, and it was shown not to do so, and they don't want a repeat of that exercise. So there was a a big meeting between Zelensky and top US officials yesterday on this very subject. There'll be more talks over the weekend to try and hammer out some clarity on what security guarantees would actually mean. And from the Europeans' perspective, they're trying to say, okay, well, if push comes to shove, we're ready to continue funding Ukraine and to support its defense. And that involves Russian assets. And they're due to make a decision today, in fact, that would allow them to lengthen the time between when they have to approve a continued freeze on these assets, because they're concerned that one member country could simply object and that would then undo the freeze and threaten the EU's ability to make use of those assets. But the big test will come next week when they have to make a decision about a big loan secured on these assets, which is essential from Ukraine's point of view for continuing to fund basic government and defense operations early next year.
Tony, thank you very much for joining us. Tony Halpin, leading our coverage of Russia's economy and government. We'll be watching for developments out of those meetings in Brussels today. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this.
Now to a European company at the heart of the AI boom. ASML is the foundation on which much of the tech industry has been built over the past few years. And today we're taking a deep dive into the company's future with an exclusive conversation with the CEO, Christophe Fouquet. Our reporter, Sarah Jacob, joins us now for more. Sarah, good to speak to you. ASML has a monopoly when it comes to the machines for these very advanced chip-making powers, the ones that obviously are on the underpinning of the AI development. How serious is their competition, though? And can they keep their grip then on this industry?
Good morning. Yes, ASML manufactures the machines that are needed to produce the most advanced chips, for Nvidia, which in turn run the artificial intelligence models for firms such as OpenAI. They're the only maker of these cutting-edge machines in the world. And it wasn't easy to develop their so-called extreme ultraviolet lithography or EUV machines. It took them decades of research, then fine-tuning these machines with a network of suppliers and close collaboration with chip makers to create breakthroughs in lasers, glass, and other components. In fact, we spoke to Chris Miller, the author of the book Chip War, for the story, and he says ASML is irreplaceable. But it's true, geopolitical tensions are escalating. Other regions are pushing to develop their own chip industries and in lithography. Take, for instance, in China, Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment has received government backing to compete in the space. But we understand that those machines lag ASML's by 10 to 15 years. Then there's a startup in San Francisco called Substrate, which raised money from Peter Thiel, but it's also years away from production. So certainly there are many players that are attempting to rival ASML. But as ASML CEO Christophe Fouquet says, the entire ecosystem is very dependent. They have locked in suppliers, they have loyal customers, and Fouquet says that it's still a very challenging technology to be able to replace.
So what does ASML then need to achieve in their technological development to stay on top, Sarah?
Yeah, Fouquet was very clear, when he said that ASML mostly knows what it wants to do for its customers in the next 10 to 15 years. They're working on the three axes of better resolution, better accuracy, and productivity of their lithography machines for many years. His next big test, and we write this in the story, is whether he can lead a transition from EUV to high-NA EUV machines. Now, high-NA is aimed at enabling customers to move to chips below 2 nanometers. So the smaller the circuits on chips, that means better performance, lower heat, and less power consumption. So it's working with Intel's and other customers on this, who they are experimenting with the high-NA machines, which would make chips even more capable of running advanced applications in AI and other fields. ASML will work with its customers on getting these high-NA machines to the point that they can operate with minimal downtime through next year, and it expects to achieve high-volume manufacturing in 2027 and 2028. Sometime next decade, ASML also plans to introduce an even more advanced technology called the Hyper-NA.
Okay. So that's for the future. But what about the market in China, which has been a massive growth driver for the company in recent years? And the big question about whether political pressures become more challenging for ASML.
Yes, China has been ASML's largest market in the third quarter. It accounted for about 42% of net system sales. ASML has said previously that it expects sales in China to be significantly lower in 2026. The company basically faces curbs on what it can sell to China. It has never been allowed to sell its EUV machines as a result of export controls. The Dutch government also placed restrictions on some of its most advanced DUV machines. So if the current political climate sort of persists, the company will remain subject to these kind of curbs or export controls. But growth must come from elsewhere as well. So the global market for semiconductors is projected to rise 22% this year and more than 25% next year. And chip makers that ASML delivers its machines to are diversifying their geography. So the US government is offering billions of dollars in incentives to TSMC, Samsung, and others to build factories for chips in the US. And the more fabs that are being built, the more machines from ASML that are needed. So that's how we see that market, the other markets growing from here.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app, and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.